Here's a short, powerful hook for your story. Asterisk, she said, once you step in here, nothing will ever be the same. And the moment I crossed that threshold, I realized she wasn't just talking about the room. She was talking about me. Asterisk, if you want, I can also give 5 alternative hooks you could test for maximum YouTube engagement. Do you want me to do that? The message came unexpectedly, almost like it had been waiting for me without my knowing. A simple line of text, yet every word carried a weight that made my chest tighten. Once you step in here, nothing will ever be the same. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the faint tremor of anticipation ripple through me. There was a confidence in her words, quiet but undeniable, and it tugged at a part of me I didn't often let surface, the part that craved curiosity, that wanted to cross boundaries and see what lay beyond. The rational side of me hesitated. I barely knew her. In fact, most of my encounters with her had been fleeting glimpses, passing smiles, polite nods, and occasional casual conversation that never lingered. And yet, something about this invitation felt different. Personal, irresistible. The evening air was cool as I made my way to her door. Streetlights cast long, golden streaks on the sidewalk, and the faint hum of distant traffic created a steady rhythm beneath the pulse of my own excitement. My hand hovered over the doorknob, reluctant and eager at the same time, as if it already knew this moment would matter more than any of the ordinary nights I'd grown used to. When the door swung open, she was there. Her presence filled the frame, a combination of ease and quiet command that immediately drew me in. She smiled, a simple, small curve of her lips, but it carried a warmth that made the air feel softer, almost heavier, in a way I couldn't explain. The scent of her home hit me next, subtle but unforgettable, a mix of coffee, vanilla, and something uniquely hers, like a memory I hadn't lived yet. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was how natural she looked moving through her space, the effortless grace in the way she carried herself. Everything about her felt intentional without trying. The way her hair fell softly over one shoulder, the light in her eyes that flickered when she noticed me standing there. It was disarming, and yet there was no pressure, only an unspoken invitation, a gentle pull towards something I couldn't name but already wanted. She reached out, brushing my hand briefly as she gestured toward the living room. The contact was fleeting, accidental, or perhaps intentional, but the warmth of her skin lingered in my mind long after she moved away. My heartbeat had sped up in a way that made me hyper-aware of every small sensation. The faint scrape of my shoes against the hardwood, the soft echo of her footsteps, the quiet hum of conversation with myself about whether I was brave or foolish, enough to follow this invitation wherever it might lead. And then she spoke, her voice calm, but with a subtle edge that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "I'm glad you came." It was only a few words, but they carried a promise, or maybe a challenge. Either way, I realized in that moment that my life had shifted slightly, imperceptibly yet irrevocably. The ordinary evening I had expected had vanished. Everything was about to change, and somehow I knew that stepping inside wasn't just about entering her home. It was about stepping into something far more intricate, something that could leave nothing the same again. The first thing I noticed, stepping fully into her living room, was how alive the space felt without being overwhelming. Every object seemed carefully chosen, but not for show. Each told a story. A stack of well-worn books leaned precariously on a side table, a soft throw draped over the arm of a chair, the faint glow of a lamp casting warm light over the room. It was intimate, comfortable, the kind of space that invited you to pause and just exist. And somehow, it reflected her, confident, thoughtful, quietly captivating. She moved around the room with a natural ease, carrying herself in a way that made me aware of every subtle motion. The curve of her back, the way her hands lingered on surfaces, the soft click of her heels against the hardwood. I found myself watching, feeling a mixture of admiration and cautious intrigue. There was a rhythm to her, a kind of elegance that wasn't flashy but demanded attention all the same. And the more I observed, the more I realized I wanted to be a part of it. Not intrusively, but as someone allowed into the margins of her world. She gestured toward the sofa, a simple motion, yet somehow intimate. I lowered myself into the seat, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her presence nearby. She offered me a cup of tea, the aroma of chamomile mingling with the faint scent of her perfume. My fingers brushed the cup as I took it, and the lingering warmth against my skin made me pause for a moment longer than necessary. That small contact, so ordinary in another context, suddenly felt charged, almost like an unspoken acknowledgement of something neither of us was ready to name yet. As we settled into conversation, I noticed the little things. The way her eyes followed my movements with quiet curiosity, the soft tilt of her head when she laughed, the gentle inflection in her voice that made even casual words feel significant. Her laughter was low, warm, and it made the room feel lighter, though my chest felt heavier with every glance she sent in my direction. There was something intoxicating about the juxtaposition of calm confidence and subtle warmth. It was a combination I couldn't quite place, yet couldn't ignore. I found myself leaning in without realizing it, drawn by the ease with which she spoke and the way the space between us seemed to shrink naturally. Our conversation flowed easily, yet I felt the undercurrent of tension beneath the words, the kind that makes your heartbeat quicken and your mind sharpen. Every smile, every casual touch of her hand as she gestured, every subtle shift of her body toward mine seemed to carry a silent question. How far was I willing to let this go? By the time the first hour had passed, I knew something had changed. The room, once just a collection of objects and warm light, now felt like a world I wanted to be a part of. And as I looked at her, standing near the window with the city lights spilling across her face, I realized the truth I hadn't yet admitted aloud. I was already drawn in, not by her words, not by the invitation, but by the quiet, magnetic presence that made the ordinary feel electric. I had crossed the threshold, yes, but more importantly, I had crossed into something entirely new, something that could not, remain ordinary. As the evening deepened, the easy flow of conversation began to take on a different quality. It was no longer just polite small talk or laughter at casual observations. It became something quieter, more intimate. I noticed the subtle shifts, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of past experiences, the faint tremor in her voice when a memory carried weight, the careful pauses that suggested there was more beneath the surface than she let on. And for some reason, I wanted to see it all, not to pry, but to understand. I began to share more of myself than I normally would. The words felt lighter somehow in her presence, as if the room itself absorbed the tension I usually carried alone. I found myself describing small details of my life, memories I hadn't thought about in years, and I watched as her gaze lingered on me, steady and unjudging. There was no rush in her listening, no pressure to respond immediately, just the quiet warmth of someone who cared enough to notice. At one point, I spoke of a failure, a moment that had stayed with me, and I expected some kind of dismissal or polite reassurance. Instead, she reached out, not too close, not too forcefully, and rested her hand briefly on my forearm. The touch was simple, almost accidental, yet the effect was profound. I felt a flicker of something deep inside, a gentle recognition that this connection was more than conversation. It was understanding, empathy, a bridge between two lives that had barely touched before tonight. Her own stories came out in fragments, each revealing vulnerability wrapped in quiet confidence. She spoke of decisions she had wrestled with, of risks she had taken that hadn't always turned out as planned, of moments of loneliness she rarely let anyone see. And with every revelation, I felt the walls I often kept around myself soften just a little. Sharing these moments wasn't easy for either of us, yet the space we had created, small, warm, and unhurried, allowed it to happen naturally. There was an unspoken rhythm developing, a give and take that transcended words. I noticed how our bodies leaned subtly toward one another during laughter, how our hands occasionally brushed on the armrest, how her eyes would catch mine in those brief, electric moments that lingered long after our gaze shifted away. Each pause between words seemed charged with quiet tension, a testament to the trust slowly building in this room. I realized then that intimacy wasn't just about proximity or grand gestures. It was about noticing the smallest things, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the careful enunciation of certain words, the way her shoulders relaxed when she sensed genuine attention. Every detail was a thread, weaving an invisible connection between us, fragile yet undeniable. By the end of that part of the evening, the room no longer felt like a living room. It felt like a private world, a place where our vulnerabilities could coexist without fear. And in that warmth, I became acutely aware that the connection forming here wasn't fleeting. It was deliberate, slow, and entirely alive. It was a promise neither of us had spoken aloud, but both of us felt in the quiet rhythm of the room had grown quieter, not because conversation had ended, but because something unspoken had begun to settle between us. It was a tension that wasn't loud or demanding. It was the kind that made the air feel heavier, yet electric, charged with possibilities neither of us dared name. I felt it in the subtle shifts of her posture, the slight leaning forward when she spoke, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of a book before letting go. And I noticed my own reactions, the way my chest tightened, the way my heartbeat seemed to echo in my ears, the way I suddenly became hyper-aware of the space between us. Her gaze was a quiet challenge, lingering a beat too long when she caught my eye, drawing me in without words. I caught myself studying the curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes, the way her shoulder dipped ever so slightly as she shifted in the chair. There was a playfulness there, subtle but deliberate, like she knew the effect she had on me and was testing how far she could push it without breaking the fragile barrier of propriety. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but something held me back. Part respect, part hesitation, part the delicious uncertainty of not knowing how she would respond. The conversation danced along ordinary topics, but beneath each word lay an unspoken dialogue. Every laugh, every pause, every careful glance seemed loaded with double meaning. I found myself wondering how much of this was accidental and how much was intentional, a silent game that neither of us needed to announce. And yet, in the midst of that uncertainty, there was a thrill, a magnetic pull that made me lean in closer without realizing it, drawn by the gravity of her presence. At one point, as she reached for a teacup, our fingers brushed, lightly, almost fleetingly, but the contact left a lingering warmth that spread up my arm and settled somewhere deep in my chest. I felt a shiver of awareness, a sudden clarity that even the smallest gestures carried weight. The subtle brush of skin, the tilt of her head, the quiet intensity of her eyes, all of it combined to create a tension I couldn't ignore. I was both exhilarated and cautious, aware that any misstep could disrupt the delicate rhythm we had been building. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound seemed to fill the room, yet it carried a hint of challenge, a playful acknowledgement of the electricity between us. I caught myself holding her gaze longer than necessary, feeling the warmth of her attention settle over me like sunlight on skin. And in that shared moment, the line between friendship and something more felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. By the end of this evening's segment, I realized the dynamic had shifted subtly but undeniably. The ease of our earlier conversation had deepened into something charged, a silent tension that demanded awareness and patience. Every look, every movement, every accidental touch became meaningful. I knew that we were no longer simply two people sharing a space. We were two people navigating the beginnings of something far more complex, something that required careful attention, emotional honesty, and the courage to let desire linger unspoken. And in that tension, I understood. The night had only just begun, and crossing the threshold of her world had set in motion feelings I could no longer contain or ignore. The room had grown softer somehow, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Shadows from the evening light stretched across the walls, creating pockets of warmth and quiet that seemed almost deliberate. I realized I was acutely aware of her presence. Every movement, every sigh, every subtle inflection of her voice carried weight I couldn't ignore. And in that stillness, the conversation took a turn that neither of us could have predicted. It became a confession, though neither of us had yet spoken the words aloud. I felt the first stirrings of courage and hesitation intertwine as I tried to articulate what had been building quietly inside me. My voice was careful, low, hesitant, but sincere. I spoke of admiration, not just for her beauty, though that was undeniable, but for the strength in her presence, the warmth she carried, the ease with which she made the world feel smaller, more personal. As I spoke, I noticed her eyes soften, her lips curving in the faintest of smiles, and the weight in her gaze. It wasn't surprise or judgment, but recognition. Recognition of a truth I had been too cautious to voice until now. She leaned slightly closer, just enough for me to feel the faint warmth of her body near mine. The subtle scent of her perfume mingled with the fading aroma of tea, creating a heady but comforting mix that made the room feel suspended in time. For a moment, words weren't necessary. We existed in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence, the rhythm of our breathing, the soft shift of her hand as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes held mine with an intensity that spoke louder than anything either of us could say. And then, tentatively, she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, yet there was a tremor in it that betrayed the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. She admitted her curiosity, her own hesitation, the strange pull she had felt toward me since our first encounters. She didn't rush, didn't demand, but the honesty in her tone made my chest tighten with the intensity of it. I realized then that the walls we'd built around ourselves, our age difference, our cautious restraint, our unspoken fears, were beginning to crumble under the weight of shared truth. As we spoke, small gestures punctuated the conversation, her hand brushing against mine as she reached for a notebook, a brief touch on my forearm that lingered just long enough to send a jolt through me, the way we leaned toward each other instinctively during moments of shared laughter or understanding. These were not grand declarations, not overt gestures of romance. They were subtle, deliberate touches that reflected trust, curiosity, and an unspoken desire. By the end of that evening segment, the emotional air between us had shifted. Something delicate but undeniable had emerged, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings that neither of us could fully define, yet both of us understood. The tension that had lingered so long had softened into connection, a warmth that radiated not just from proximity, but from shared vulnerability. For the first time, I realized that what had started as curiosity and fascination had grown into something far more profound, a quiet, tender, and irrevocable bond. And in that realization, I understood that crossing her threshold hadn't just changed my evening. It had changed the trajectory of my heart.